And this is one of life's beautiful ironies, in that AI is causing havoc for the grid and all the reasons you just talked about, but it also represents potentially the saviour.
All the technology exists, it's just about orchestrating it in a more intelligent way to make sure that we're keeping up with this rapid load growth that we're seeing.
So Brendan, thanks for being here.
No worries, glad to be here.
Not many people wake up every day like you do thinking about the electricity grid. They just sort of flick on the switch and expect the lights to come on. But I feel like in the last couple of years, it's become a lot more of a mainstream topic. And it's probably because of the other big mainstream topic that's going on at the moment, which is AI. Why don't we start there? Can you dive in a little bit and talk to us about the relationship between AI and the electricity grid?
Yeah, for sure. So ultimately, this AI infrastructure that we're now seeing on the grid involves the connection of these really large data centers, which are really chewing up huge amounts of the capacity, both across the transmission network, so the network that supplies power over long distances, as well as the distribution network, where we supply power to households and businesses. And effectively, what we're seeing is these hyperscalers wanting to connect to the grids. They're wanting to connect in times that are really cut down. So usually those sorts of really large loads would take potentially many years to connect. But obviously with this, race for, call it artificial intelligence supremacy, they're wanting to connect significantly quicker. And what that's leading to is the utilities who manage and own the poles and wires, the network infrastructure, they're really not set up at the moment to be able to handle the sheer amount of connection requests that are coming through. So ultimately, or fundamentally, there's just not enough network infrastructure at the moment to allow these networks to connect. So I can give you a bit of a concrete example. We've got, so in Sydney today, it's a really hot day. It's going to be 37 degrees. So across all of New South Wales, we're expecting to hit a peak of about 12 gigawatts across all 4 utilities in New South Wales. Just one of those New South Wales utilities alone, they actually have 12 gigawatts in their inquiry bucket at the moment for data centers. So just with one utility, they're expecting to connect gigawatts of data centers within the next few years, which is 50%, sometimes 100% of the total peak load of those networks. So it's just staggering numbers just in terms of the load growth that we're expected to see. And the big point there is that load growth has actually been quite stagnant over the last few years. So over the last 15 years, loads haven't really grown, not only in Australia, but around the world. We've been quite stagnant. But we're seeing this really interesting inflection point where it's not only AI that's causing this huge amount of load growth, but also the electrification of the economy too. So electrification of transport and industry has led to this inflection point and this coalescing of these really large problems on how do we get more capacity out of the grid? How can we connect more things quickly without overloading the network infrastructure?
And the reason AI has been such a hot topic when it comes to the electricity grid is that huge amount of load that's coming aboard. And we did the numbers on this, and since ChatGPT launched in 2022, the growth in data center energy load globally since 2022 to 2025 is roughly equal to an entire of Australia's energy load, which just blows my mind.
That's correct.
And it's a huge, huge driver of demand. But it's also, if we're there's a lot of talk at the moment about the geopolitical importance of winning the AI race. The electricity grid really is a big roadblock potentially to winning the AI race. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the grid fundamentally as it stands today in Australia and around the world is fundamentally this bottleneck to not only the decarbonisation of the economy, but also the scaling of AI fundamentally. So the grid operators and how they've managed the network infrastructure to date has been a very static way of managing the network. So traditionally, if you're just thinking about the grid 20 years ago, we've just got households and businesses who are wanting to connect, and obviously large industry. You can basically plan and operate that portion of the network just thinking about your worst case scenario of the year. What's the worst 4 hours of the year where the network's at full capacity, and I'll just use that in my planning decisions. Now that you've got these data centers that are wanting to connect and they're effectively adding 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50% of the peak load on top of your existing grid capacity, means you need to get a lot more intelligent around how you're thinking about both planning and operating these really, really large loads. And that's where flexibility comes into the piece. So we need to shift away from this more static, centralized way of planning and operating a grid into a much more flexible, dynamic way of operating grids that can dynamically shift these loads so that we don't need to just double or triple the amount of poles and wires out in the network, but we can connect things more intelligently to really push more electrons through that same network infrastructure.
And this is one of life's beautiful ironies, in that AI is causing havoc for the grid and all the reasons you just talked about, but it also presents potentially the savior. We're going to come into how Gridsight fits into this in a little bit, but it's a really complicated real-world system at its core, which machine learning and AI is really built for understanding well. Before we get there though, talk to us a little bit around the history of the grid. Let's sort of pop up sort of 10,000 feet. Talk to us a little bit about how old the grid is, how it's evolved over the time.
Yeah, so the grid, you could argue, is the world's most largest and complex machine. I think that's pretty well known. And the grid fundamentally was designed to, allow the transportation of energy across vast distances to, again, power homes and businesses. So traditionally, the grid is a very centralized system. So you have very large centralized generators, so large, coal-fired power stations, those sorts of things, which connect into what's called a transmission network. So the large transmission towers you see across highways, that's to transport the electricity over vast distances. And then that comes into substations where it can be distributed into, the suburbs and towns we live in to supply power to the end consumers. So it's been very centered around this one-way flow of power, ultimately.
Talk to us a little bit about the transmission network versus the distribution network in terms of the relative size and complexity between the two.
Yeah, so the transmission network fundamentally is, I guess, a lot bigger from a geographical standpoint, but it's slightly less complex in the sense that there's actually less assets. So you have, a handful of really large generators and then some large transmission lines. So the number of entities or generators that are actually bidding in and, supplying power to that portion of the network relatively is actually quite small. What we're seeing though is in the distribution network, which traditionally was the more simple part of the network, everyone just used power in their homes. It was pretty straightforward. We're now seeing this shift to it now becoming the more complex and dynamic part of managing a grid. So the distribution networks where we supply power to homes and businesses, but now in the distribution network, we have EV chargers, we've got solar, we've got batteries. So in the transmission network, you might have 10, 20 large generators. In the distribution network in Australia, we have millions of rooftop solar systems, batteries, these sorts of things, which are just adding huge amounts of complexity in the way that you manage and operate a grid. It's not as simple as just planning for the worst day of the year. We need to plan for, the year-round scenarios, understand the intermittency of these renewable resources. So we're getting complexity at both ends of the spectrum now. The transmission network is experiencing huge amounts of complexity with these large loads and generators, and the distribution network has huge amounts of complexity due to solar batteries and EVs, which are proliferating across the world.
And people who haven't really spent time thinking about the electricity grid might be thinking about it as similar to a communications network or an IP network where you have lots of data and lots of abilities to understand what's going on. How is the grid different to that?
Yeah, it's quite surprising to see the lack of visibility that the grid operators have had to date. We take it for granted, as you said, people just turn the lights on and they work. But for a lot of the last 100 years, the grid operators, particularly in the distribution network, have effectively been running blind. So there's been lots of visibility in the transmission network, but the distribution network just hasn't had the amount of data available to quantify really what's happening under the hood at that household level. But we're seeing this transition now. So there's this genesis between the complexity of the grid, but also the amount of data that's available to gain insights into that network. So things like smart meters, better IoT monitoring, improved network modeling techniques, and software techniques like AI themselves allow us to actually model the grid in a much more sophisticated and granular way. So we're seeing this coalescing of all these different technologies, which are really going to be able to open up the possibilities on how we can really realize this decentralized and flexible grid.
And if the operators mess it up and there's an imbalance between supply and demand, what happens and why is that important?
Yeah, the implications are huge. So with this added complexity and all this increasing load, fundamentally, you have a few options really. Either you build more network, you just build more poles and wires, which ultimately is just going to lead to increased electricity bills. That's a huge topic at the moment. Electricity bills are on the rise, which is really hurting homeowners and businesses in being able to, financially manage that level of complexity. But more fundamentally too, this increased load is adding a risk to the network. So, the increased rise in blackouts and these sorts of things. So there's a whole chain of events that can take place if we don't manage this correctly. Everything from the financial implications to people, as well as the actual reliability of the network itself. If we don't keep up, we'll be seeing more blackouts, worse reliability, which is going to have huge impacts on the economy.
And we've been talking about the grid, which is really how the power makes its way from generation to use cases. At the core of all this is also the generation part, which is and particularly the mix of energy generation and how that's changed the grid. I think we're clearly in a transition from primarily fossil fuels generated energy into more renewables onto the grid. And there's all sorts of political conversations about how that transition is taking place, what speed it needs to take place, etc. But is there at least sort of broad consensus around what the long-term energy mix looks like, or even the medium term?
Absolutely. It goes without being said that renewables are on the rise, and particularly in Australia, within the next 5 years, 70 to 80% of the mix of energy in the system will be renewable based. And that's been really exciting to see, both, I guess, personally and professionally for me. Irrespective of the political implications, households and businesses are continuing to invest in solar, batteries and EVs. So in Australia alone, we'll see this 70 to 80% of renewables within the next 5 years that will make up the vast majority of the mix of energy within Australia. And the largest proportion of that will be from rooftop solar. In Australia alone, it's over 1 in every 3 houses now have rooftop solar. So by 2030, it's actually going to be the largest generator in all of the NEM up and down the east coast of Australia, which is just unheard of. The fact that you can have gigawatt scale renewable capacity that's just coming from millions of small resources as opposed to a single large coal-fired power station. So that will remain to be, particularly in Australia and increasingly around the world, this renewable mix will be the largest contributor. But we also need to have more firm capacity there as well. The key constraint with renewables is the intermittency of these resources. The sun's not always shining and the wind's not always blowing. So how do we manage that intermittency? So key one there is obviously battery energy storage is a big one, which is really just starting to hockey stick in a big way in Australia. Since June alone, with these government incentives that have been introduced, there's been 120,000 batteries installed in the last few months within households. That's just a staggering amount of capacity that we have there just sitting within people's homes, which is amazing. But then we also have the ability to provide more firm capacity. So in the instances where the batteries don't have any charge or the sun's not shining, there's still going to need to be a mix of more firm generation, for example, gas peaker plants and these sorts of things. So the key thing here is having a more orchestrated mix of these resources where we can dynamically manage them in a much more intelligent way to keep up with this increasing load that we're seeing. So all the technology exists. It's just about orchestrating it in a more intelligent way to make sure that we're keeping up with this rapid load growth that we're seeing.
And as the grid evolves in this new world, one of the real reasons why it's been put under huge strain, particularly here in Australia, is the penetration of distributed resources, particularly renewables. Household solar is through the roof. Battery storage is coming online very, very quickly. These are all fantastic things to getting us towards a future of net zero and decarbonisation, but it's causing a fair bit of chaos on the grid as it stands today. Why is Australia so far down this path in some of the challenges that we're seeing in the grid, and how is the rest of the world going to follow?
Australia's in a really unique position for a variety of reasons. So first things first, we have the world leading rooftop solar installations. So as I said, 1 in every 3 houses has rooftop solar, which is just staggering amounts compared to other parts of the world. So that's one key piece. And a lot of that is driven by, first of all, generous government incentives that were introduced in the early 2010s, but as well as our very unique position of having, great solar resources here in the country. So that's one thing. The other piece that makes Australia quite unique is just our, really vast land area with a relatively small population comparatively. So this has led to really, really large networks. So we need huge amounts of electrical network infrastructure to actually supply what is a relatively small amount of people. So that's led to a system that is prone to significant constraints and congestion across the grid. So we've seen this genesis of huge amounts of decentralized renewables with a highly constrained grid. So a lot of the challenges that distribution networks and transmission networks around the world that are going to face as they continue to see this load growth and rise in decentralized renewables, we're seeing first here in Australia. So a lot of the challenges we're solving at Gridsight in terms of how can you manage a grid with these millions of dynamic resources without needing to just continually upgrade and build more network we're starting to see emerge in other pockets of the world, not only on the solar front, but also, the rise of electric vehicles as well. So we almost have a bit of people often call it a postcard from the future, Australia's energy system, compared to what we're seeing in, the US and Europe.
And so we've got sort of these twin mega trends that are impacting the grid at the moment and causing havoc. You've got this spike of demand, AI data centers, EVs, general electrification of industry on the one hand, and then you've got the increased penetration of renewables, storage, solar, batteries at the edge of the grid, which is completely reshaping how the grid operates. It's causing chaos for the grid. The grid is the ultimate roadblock to getting to a net zero future. How do we fix this? How can we use software to help with this?
Yeah, that's the big problem. So, as I said, all the technology that we need to achieve this already exists. So, all the inverters, solar, electric vehicles, all that technology exists. It's just a matter of orchestrating it in fundamentally different ways. So, the key issue and the key constraint utilities are seeing at the moment is that software and systems are very set up for just managing the static network capacity. So what's my worst day of the year? I'm going to plan my network for that individual, 4 hours of the year where there's challenges. Where the software needs to come into it is being able to look at the data and have very much more a dynamic model of the grid that can shift and ebb and flow as the constraints of the network are shifting over the course of the days, weeks, months, and years. And being able to use AI to be able to dynamically model the physics of the network and run optimization algorithms to orchestrate all these technologies so that we're effectively pushing more electrons through that same, network infrastructure is the core problem that needs to be solved and the key one that we're tackling at Gridsight.
And you started with Australian utilities, and as you said, they are in the crucible of the problem here, in that Australia has probably a larger hair on fire problem with the grid than just about anywhere else in the world. How sophisticated are the utilities here relative to other parts of the world in thinking these problems through?
The sophistication across utilities varies. Australia is leading in some instances, but other parts of the world are leading in others. So we've spoken a lot about the solar resources and the rooftop solar constraints that we're seeing across the grids here in Australia. So Australia certainly is leading the way on that front. But then when you think about other technologies like electric vehicles, for example, and the AI data center problem that we're seeing, the US market is actually quite far ahead in that one too. So in the US, we're seeing lots of managed charge programs for coordinating household EV charges to improve the grid. Obviously, the data center problem is key here in Australia, but also key in the US as well. So while we're seeing, Australia leading the world in some instances, there are pockets of other markets that are also leading, as it relates to EVs and other technologies as well. So what we're trying to do is, bring all these world-leading aspects together that we can, build software not only to solve the solar problem here in Australia, but ultimately solve what is, this idea of realizing a flexible grid that can dynamically manage these millions of resources in a much more effective way.
And talking about how you work with utilities, talk to us a little bit about the secret sauce that sits underneath the Gridsight software.
Yeah, so fundamentally we are building an electrical digital twin of the network. So these utilities, they have what is now orders of magnitude more data available to them than what was even available, call it 5 years ago. And these data sources are often quite siloed. You have a system which has your network model or network map, then you've got data from people's houses with smart meters, you've got a control system which has telemetry coming in as well. And these systems are often quite siloed. So bringing all that data together into the one system, i.e. the Gridsight software, provides us with this foundational data layer in which we can build these more dynamic and flexible models on top of. So Gridsight really is pulling in all these data sources to build this foundational data layer. So utilities, they do everything from planning the network, they've got connection requests coming in of people wanting to connect data centers, EVs, solar, etc. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is the actual real-time management and orchestration of these devices, into the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. What we're doing is we're using this foundational data layer to completely augment that end-to-end process. Everything from connection requests coming in, being able to manage and dynamically model the queue of these, EVs and data centers coming online, all the way through to the real-time management and dynamic modeling of the grid to flexibly adjust these resources. So this is a full end-to-end stack, across multiple teams within the utility organization that are really needing this more modern way of managing and modeling a dynamic grid that is very, very different to the more static heuristics and rules of thumb that they're used to using in their day-to-day.
You touched on the interconnection queue there, which is something that, again, amazes me, particularly in the US at the moment. Can you talk to me a little bit about how much energy capacity is sitting in a queue waiting to come online?
Yeah, we're seeing this same trend with utilities in Australia and the US and around the world fundamentally. So there's multiple queues. So multiple people are wanting to, or developers, entities are wanting to connect to the grid, everything from data centers through to, EV charging infrastructure, solar developers, all these sorts of different entities who now see energy as this huge unlock of value for the economy. And what we're seeing is, in a lot of instances, the utilities will typically have a peak load, so that, the few hours per year where their, peak load is at the maximum. And what we're seeing is, for a lot of utilities, the amount of power that's actually in the queue is equal to, or in some instances exceeding, what the peak load of the network is, which is just a fundamentally different way that they're needing to plan the grid. Traditionally, some utilities we work with in the States, they have peak loads of around 7 gigawatts. When you're thinking about a 1 to 5 year planning, maybe you're thinking load growths in the hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts. Now they need to think about, I have a 7 gigawatt peaking network, and I have another 7, 8, or 9 gigawatts in the queue. How am I going to double my network capacity? It's just a completely foreign way that they're needing to now plan for network upgrades. It's just staggering, the level of load that is sitting in the queue.
But when we talk about the grid being the roadblock to more renewables coming online, we literally mean that in the sense that there is more energy capacity prepared to come online, and most of it renewables, than we have capacity currently on the system in the US and Australia. And the reason we can't bring it online quickly enough is largely the grid's not keeping up to speed.
Exactly right. To conduct these studies to understand, I've got a data center, I've got, a bank of fast charging stations, whatever it may be, that want to connect. These studies usually take the utilities, best case scenario months, some case scenario maybe a year to conduct these studies. And then there's also the build out itself. So if you need to build new network infrastructure, it takes these utilities, in some instances, years to build the network infrastructure. So we're starting to see this paradigm shift towards, can we use data to more accurately model the grid as it is today? And if there is no capacity, can we allow people to connect, whether it's a data center or a renewable resource, but have it flexibly connect? So if the grid's under strain, we can actually send it a signal to say, hey, the grid's under pressure at the moment. Can we wind down your load? Can we shift some of that load to a different time of the day? And we'll allow you to connect today, as opposed to connecting in 2, 3, 4 years' time.
So really at its heart, a lot of what Gridsight is enabling is a large number of renewable projects coming online in a much faster way, enabling the utilities to effectively accept them onto the grid.
That's exactly right. Using this fundamental digital twin layer that we have across the network and allowing to actually model the dynamics of the system, not only for the worst case scenario, but over the entire year, allows the utilities to get confidence, yes, we can connect, but it also gives the developers and the people wanting to connect these resources confidence that, they're happy with maybe being curtailed or having their production reduced 2 or 3% of the year, while still being able to, get the investment that they're requiring out of there.
And all of that accelerates our path towards a decarbonised future, which is, I think, something that we all are after. Tell us a little bit about where you are as a company, though, with Gridsight. How long have you been around for? Sort of where is the business today?
So Gridsight was founded 5 years ago. So we're founded, as many other companies were, outside of COVID. So my background was in the utility sector. I started right around when Australia was actually experiencing this solar boom, and it was interesting to see, as a young engineer, a lot of the, industry really starting to come to terms with the fact that this solar boom was happening and all the issues that were going on. And a lot of people were complaining about, it's causing so many issues on the grid. And I just saw it, this isn't a problem. This is just such a huge opportunity. And now we're just seeing that across multiple facets of the energy landscape, AI data centers, EVs as well. So that was really the genesis of Gridsight. And where we're at as a company today, we're working with about half the utilities across Australia, across a variety of projects, everything from helping them with their planning decisions to the actual real-time orchestration of, rooftop solar to improve the grid and the constraints that we're seeing on the grid. And we've just started to expand into the US as well. So 2025 was a really big year for us, where we had our I guess, core customer base here in Australia would prove out we could solve a lot of the core problems we're seeing here in this very emerging new market. And for us, 2025 was about proving, we can go to the US and solve some similarly very big challenging problems. And yeah, the team's been working extremely hard, and we've been able to land our first 2 big customers in the US, which has been an incredible feat. It's very hard to sell and work with utilities. They're very, they're regulated monopolies. They're quite slow in terms of how they operate and the adoption of new technology. So it's been amazing to see our team at Gridsight be able to go into that market and within 12 months, sell to some of the biggest utilities in the country, where there's other, vendors that have been in the States for 5 years who haven't been able to do that in that period of time. So yeah, it's been an incredible year for us.
We talk a lot about here at Airtree, sort of areas that Australia has a real competitive advantage to compete globally with the best of the best in software and technology generally. And in many cases, Australian businesses selling to global customers are there because they have founders who know the industries very well, but there's not a particular reason why Australia has a competitive advantage in it. In energy, that is certainly not the case. Australia, for all the reasons we talked about, is really further ahead in many of these aspects than anywhere else in the world. So there's a very good reason why an Australian company should be competing with the best of the best overseas. What are you seeing when you talk to US utilities? What are they learning from the Australian market?
As we spoke about, the Australian market really is leading the way in this idea of a flexible grid at scale. How can we manage and operate a grid that is, the dynamics of the grid are changing, every 5, 10, 15 minutes, and ultimately use these millions of resources we have to get more electrons through that same network infrastructure. So other parts of the world really see Australia as a leader in this space, particularly what we've been able to do with residential solar, but that also crosses over to, flexibility for data centers and for EVs and these sorts of other technologies. So having this core team here that has been able to see the future and really start to build towards what the grid should be in 10, 15, 20 years time has meant that we've really got a head start and have the scale we need, that it's not just, we're out of this idea of pilots. The utilities for the last 5 years, it's almost been death by pilots, just these trials that go nowhere. Whereas in Australia, we're solving these real meaningful problems and actually are at scale in delivering these solutions to utilities across their entire network. And the US networks that we're working with are really seeing that as a huge differentiating factor for us. We're not just a science experiment. We're true at scale, allowing gigawatts of renewable resources to be managed on the grid. And I think they really appreciate the effort that has gone into, building the software infrastructure required to actually realize this flexible grid.
And Brendan, you're an electrical engineer by training.
Yep.
What's that? Talk to us a little bit about your personal journey as to becoming a founder of a business.
Yeah, so as I said, I was an electrical engineer, so I worked for a utility here in Australia and saw firsthand the boom in solar. So that was really an extremely interesting time for me as a 20-year-old to just see this huge transition happening before my eyes, and that really got me excited about how decentralized, renewable resources and this more dynamic grid can actually transform fundamentally how grids are operated. So while I was working at the utility, I became just really passionate about the space and just wanted to go a lot deeper. So I decided to effectively do a PhD in the area. I realized that the speed at which I wanted to see this transition happen, I probably wasn't going to allow myself to move quickly enough in the utility sector. So I was like, I've got to do this by myself. I saw the best way to do that was to just basically prove out that this can be done. So I did a PhD fundamentally on how you can leverage solar batteries and electric vehicles in people's homes that not only benefit the owners of those devices, benefit the household in terms of, better comfort within their home, being able to earn more money by flexibly bidding these devices around time of use tariffs and those sorts of things. But the other side of that coin was, how can these devices actually benefit the grid as well? Because that was the key thing I was seeing, was all these engineers were saying solar's bad, it's hurting the grid. Or my mindset was solar is great, we can use it to actually benefit the grid. So my PhD was really focused around that. I led a team of students building a smart solar powered house at the University of Wollongong that we took to a competition. And then my PhD was really around, proving out with a real house with real solar batteries and electric vehicles, how it can be used to benefit the grid. And also fundamentally out of that PhD, a lot of the work I was doing around optimization and grid modeling led into Gridsight. So my co-founder, Kurt, we've been best friends since before we were born, really. Our parents were friends. And Kurt's got a commercialization in tech background. So towards the end of my PhD, I was, chatting with Kurt over Zoom one night during COVID over a few beers. And I was talking to him about the ideas I had on really just transforming the way grids are operated. So that led into the foundation and the forming of Gridsight.
And one of the things I've been most impressed working with you guys over the years is that there is such a strong mission drive behind Gridsight. Why do you, as the founder of Gridsight, want this business to be a very big business?
The grid itself is the biggest bottleneck to the decarbonisation of the economy fundamentally. I truly believe that energy abundance for humanity is one of the key indicators towards a better quality of life for all. And I'm a father now, and if we really want to realize, the full decarbonisation, electrification of the economy, net zero, the grid has to be solved. Like this bottleneck and this static way of managing the grids will be the, straw that breaks the camel's back if we don't solve this now. So for me, being able to build the software that just completely removes this bottleneck, allows energy abundance for everyone, allows us to scale incredible technology like AI and, realize all these renewable resources on the grid is just such an incredibly motivating and one of the biggest challenges that I think the entire economy is facing. So there's, in my mind, no better challenge to be working on.
What a great way to end it, Brendan. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for having us along with the journey.
No worries. Thank you for having me.